The night you decide to help a stranger can become the night your entire life changes forever. Snow hammered against the flickering neon sign of the Blue Cedar Motel, the icy wind screaming through the empty Wyoming highway like something alive. Maddie Hayes pulled her coat tighter as she stepped outside with a trash bag in one hand and her room key dangling from her fingers. The old motel sat 20 miles outside Cheyenne, forgotten by almost everyone except exhausted truck drivers and people with nowhere else to go. Midnight shifts were always the hardest during winter. The silence felt heavier after midnight, especially during storms like this one. Maddie tossed the garbage into the rusted dumpster and rubbed her freezing hands together before glancing toward the road. Headlights blurred through the snow for a second before disappearing again. The storm was getting worse. The radio inside the lobby had already warned people to stay off Interstate 80 until morning. She was about to head back inside when something caught her eye near the vending machine beside room 12. A figure, someone sitting on the frozen pavement. Her heart jumped. For half a second she froze, staring through the blowing snow. Then she slowly stepped closer. It was a man. Tall, dark coat, soaked white with snow. One arm resting against the wall like he barely had the strength to stay upright. Maddie stopped a few feet away. "Sir?" she called carefully. No answer. The wind whipped harder, rattling the motel windows behind her. She swallowed. "Sir, are you okay?" The man lifted his head slightly. Snow clung to his dark hair. His face looked pale beneath the parking lot lights, his jaw tense like he was trying not to collapse. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice sounded weak and rough from the cold. Maddie immediately knew he wasn't fine. His hands were shaking violently. One sleeve of his coat was torn near the shoulder, exposing a dark stain underneath. Not dramatic, not gruesome, just enough to tell her he'd been hurt somehow. Her stomach tightened. The motel owner, Rick, always warned her never to trust strangers during night shifts. "That's how people disappear on the news," he liked to say. And honestly, Maddie usually listened. But then the man tried to stand and nearly fell sideways against the wall. Something about the sight hit her harder than it should have. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the loneliness in his eyes. Or maybe it was because for one horrible second, he reminded her of her younger brother Danny the night he got stranded during a blizzard 8 years ago. Danny had been 19. His truck broke down 20 miles from home. Nobody stopped to help him in time. Maddie still remembered identifying his scarf at the hospital the next morning. Navy blue wool. Her mother had knitted it for him before she died. Ever since then, Maddie had never been able to ignore someone freezing alone in the snow, even when common sense told her to walk away. The stranger looked up at her again, exhausted blue eyes barely focused. "I'll leave in a minute," he said quietly. "Just needed to sit down." Maddie looked toward the empty highway, then back at him. Snow was already collecting on his shoulders. Another hour out here, and he could end up seriously sick. She exhaled slowly. "You're not staying out here tonight." The man frowned faintly like he thought he misheard her. "What?" "Come inside before you freeze." "I can't pay for a room." "I didn't ask if you could." He stared at her for a moment, almost suspicious of kindness itself. Maddie recognized that look too. She saw it in people who checked into the motel with nowhere left to go. People who had forgotten what it felt like when someone helped without wanting something back. She motioned toward the office. "Come on." The man hesitated before finally pushing himself upright. He was taller than she expected, maybe 6'3", broad shoulders hidden beneath the ruined coat. Even injured and exhausted, there was something strangely composed about him. Controlled, like he wasn't used to showing weakness in front of anyone. Maddie walked beside him through the snow toward the lobby. Inside, warmth wrapped around them instantly. The tiny office smelled like burnt coffee and old pine cleaner. Christmas lights blinked weakly around the front desk, even though it was already January. Rick looked up from his television in the back room and immediately frowned. "Who's this?" Maddie grabbed a towel from behind the counter. Guy almost froze outside. Rick lowered the volume on the TV. "Maddie, no. He just needs a room for the night." "And who's paying for it?" She paused. Her paycheck had barely covered rent last week. Her old Jeep needed new brakes. And she had exactly $84 left in her checking account until Friday. Still, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her debit card. "I am." Rick stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You don't even know him." Maddie glanced toward the stranger. He looked uncomfortable now, almost ashamed. Snow melted slowly from his hair onto the cheap lobby carpet. For some reason, that made her decision final. "Room 12, she said softly. "Just for tonight." The stranger looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Maddie handed him the old brass key. "Yeah," she replied with a tired smile. "I think I do." The old heater inside room 12 rattled like it was fighting for its life against the Wyoming winter. Maddie stood awkwardly near the doorway holding a first aid kit while the stranger sat at the edge of the bed, steam rising faintly from the cup of hot chocolate she had forced into his hands 5 minutes earlier. Up close, he looked even more exhausted. Not dangerous, just worn down in a way that felt heavier than physical pain. The television mounted above the dresser played muted late-night weather reports while snow buried the highway outside inch by inch. Maddie opened the first aid kit and finally broke the silence. "You should let me look at your shoulder." The man glanced toward the torn sleeve of his coat. "It is nothing serious." "That usually means it is serious." A faint smile appeared on his face for the first time. Small, tired, but real. Maddie carefully sat beside him on the bed, leaving enough distance to keep things respectful. "I am Maddie, by the way. Adrian." "Well, Adrian, unless you secretly enjoy hypothermia, you should probably take off the coat." He hesitated for a second before slowly slipping the heavy coat from his shoulders. Maddie noticed immediately that the clothes underneath were expensive despite the damage. Not flashy, just high quality in the kind of quiet way wealthy people sometimes dressed when they did not need to prove anything. The realization flickered through her mind before disappearing again. Plenty of people own nice coats. Besides, rich men did not end up half-frozen outside roadside motels during blizzards. She gently cleaned the scrape near his shoulder while Adrian stayed unusually still. Most men talked too much when they were nervous. Adrian barely spoke at all. The silence between them felt strangely calm instead of uncomfortable. "You work here every night?" he asked quietly after a while. Maddie nodded. "Pretty much. Night shifts pay an extra $2 an hour. That cannot be enough." She laughed softly. "You sound like my landlord." Adrian looked at her for a moment. "And what does your landlord say?" "Usually something inspiring like, 'Rent is due Friday.'" Another small smile touched his face. Maddie finished taping the bandage and closed the kit. "There. You will survive. Thanks to you, apparently." She shrugged lightly. "Someone helped my mother once when I was little. She used to say kindness always comes back eventually." Adrian lowered his eyes toward the steaming cup in his hands. "Has it?" The question caught her off guard. Maddie leaned back against the chair near the window and folded her arms. Outside, snow covered the motel parking lot in white silence. "Not always," she admitted. "But I still like believing it does." Adrian looked at her like he wanted to ask something else, but stopped himself. Maddie noticed the expensive watch still hidden partly beneath his sleeve. Definitely not motel guest material. But whatever his story was, she could tell he did not want to talk about it. So instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded navy scarf. The wool looked worn from years of use. "You should use this tonight," she said, tossing it gently toward him. Adrian caught it carefully. "I cannot take this. It is just a scarf." "It matters to you." Maddie looked toward the falling snow outside the window. "It belonged to my little brother." Adrian stayed quiet. "He got stranded during a storm a long time ago," she continued softly. "Car broke down outside Laramie. Nobody stopped. The room grew still except for the sound of the old heater humming beside them. "I am sorry," Adrian said finally. Maddie forced a small smile. "Me too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian surprised her. "Most people would not have stopped tonight either." Maddie looked back at him. His expression had changed somehow. Less guarded. More human. Like whatever armor he normally wore around the world had cracked a little during the storm. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But I know what it feels like when nobody does." Adrian stared down at the navy scarf in his hands for several seconds. His thumb brushed slowly over the fabric like he was memorizing it. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do you ever get tired of carrying everyone else?" Maddie blinked. The question landed deeper than she wanted it to. She laughed softly to hide it. "You make me sound more heroic than I am." "No," Adrian said quietly. "Just lonely." The words settled heavily between them. Maddie suddenly looked away first. Nobody ever noticed that part. Not Rick. Not customers. Not the people who checked into the motel pretending not to fall apart. Most nights, she worked 12-hour shifts, ate microwave dinners alone behind the front desk, then slept in the tiny employee apartment beside the laundry room. She had friends once, plans once, but somewhere between grief and survival, life had quietly narrowed into routine. "You should get some sleep," she said gently, standing up before the conversation became too personal. Adrian nodded slowly. Maddie moved toward the door before pausing. "There are extra blankets in the closet, and the heater only works if you kick it twice." For the first time that night, Adrian let out an actual laugh. Low and warm and unexpected. It caught Maddie completely off guard. "Good to know," he said. She smiled despite herself. Then she turned off the main light and stepped into the hallway. Snow continued falling outside the motel windows as she closed the door softly behind her. But inside room 12, for the first time in what felt like years, Adrian Whitmore no longer felt completely alone. By 3 in the morning, the storm had swallowed the entire highway. Snow pressed against the motel windows in thick, white waves while Maddie sat behind the front desk with a cup of stale coffee growing cold between her hands. The old clock above the vending machine ticked loudly in the silence. Normally nights dragged at the Blue Cedar Motel, but tonight felt strangely different. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward room 12 without meaning to. She barely knew the man staying there, yet something about him lingered in her thoughts. Maybe it was the way he listened when she spoke, like her words actually mattered. Or maybe it was because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her loneliness and recognized it instantly. Maddie sighed and rubbed her tired eyes. "You are overthinking this," she muttered to herself. Rick walked out from the back office carrying a bag of potato chips. "Talking to ghosts again? Only the friendly ones." He snorted and glanced toward the hallway. "Your mystery snowman still alive?" "As far as I know." Rick lowered his voice slightly. "You should still be careful. Guy shows up bleeding in a storm without a phone or wallet. That is either a criminal or a country song." Maddie rolled her eyes. "Not everybody is dangerous, Rick. That is exactly what people say before documentaries get made about them." She laughed despite herself. The front desk phone rang suddenly, making both of them jump. Rick answered it while Maddie reached for another stack of registration forms. A minute later, his expression changed. "Road closure got worse," he said after hanging up. "State police shut down the interstate until morning." Maddie glanced toward the storm outside. "Anyone hurt?" "Couple stranded drivers, apparently." Her chest tightened a little. Wyoming winters could turn deadly fast. Another reason she could never leave someone outside alone. About 20 minutes later, the hallway door opened quietly. Adrian stepped into the lobby wearing the same dark sweater from earlier, his hair still slightly damp from the shower. The navy scarf rested loosely around his neck now. Maddie tried not to notice how strangely natural it looked on him. "The heater finally surrendered," he said calmly. "I think it made one last heroic sound before dying completely." Rick looked up from the television. "Room 12. Adrian nodded once. "That heater has been fighting death since the Clinton administration," Rick muttered. Maddie stood immediately. "I will grab extra blankets." She disappeared into the laundry room and returned carrying 2 thick comforters. Adrian reached for them automatically. "You do not have to keep rescuing me." "Actually, I kind of do," she replied lightly. "It is becoming a pattern." For a second his expression softened again. That same guarded sadness flickered behind his eyes before disappearing. Maddie noticed he still moved carefully, protecting his injured shoulder without realizing it. "Did you eat anything besides hot chocolate tonight?" she asked. Adrian looked genuinely unsure. "I do not think so. That is not an answer normal adults give." Rick chuckled from behind the counter. "She does this to everybody. Last week she threatened to truck her with soup because he had not eaten in 12 hours. Exactly my point." Maddie ignored him and motioned toward the tiny employee kitchen behind the lobby. "Come on." 10 minutes later, Adrian sat across from her at the small folding table while a can of tomato soup warmed on the stove beside grilled cheese sandwiches. The kitchen lights buzzed softly overhead. It was not elegant. The linoleum floor was peeling near the sink, and the coffee machine probably belonged in a museum. But somehow the tiny room felt warm against the storm outside. Adrian watched quietly while Maddie flipped the sandwiches in the pan. "You cook like somebody's mom from the Midwest," he said. She pointed the spatula at him. "Careful. That is how people lose grilled cheese privileges." Another low laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Maddie noticed something strange then. Every time Adrian laughed, he seemed surprised by it himself. like joy had become unfamiliar territory. She carried the plates to the table and slid one toward him. "So," she said carefully, "what happened out there tonight?" Adrian looked down at the steam rising from the soup. For a long moment, she thought he would avoid the question entirely. Then finally he spoke. "I needed to disappear for a while." Maddie leaned back slightly. "That sounds dramatic." It felt dramatic. From what? Adrian's jaw tightened subtly. People. The answer was simple, but something about the way he said it carried years of exhaustion behind it. Maddie studied him quietly. Whoever Adrian really was, he carried pressure the same way exhausted people carried grief. Heavy, constant, invisible unless you looked closely. "Well," she said softly after a moment, "the Blue Cedar Motel is probably the last place anybody important would look." Adrian looked up at her then, and for the first time all night, something vulnerable slipped through his calm expression completely. That, he admitted quietly, was exactly the idea. The wind roared outside the kitchen windows while snow buried the empty highway deeper in silence. But inside the tiny motel kitchen, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of grilled cheese sandwiches, Adrian Whitmore slowly began realizing that the most peaceful moment of his entire life was happening in a place nobody wealthy would ever notice. The storm finally weakened just before dawn. By 6 a.m, the snow had settled into thick white drifts around the motel parking lot, and pale gray lights stretched across the frozen Wyoming highway. Maddie sat behind the front desk fighting exhaustion while old country music played softly from the radio near the coffee machine. She had not slept. Not because of the storm. Because every time she closed her eyes, she kept replaying Adrian's expression from the kitchen the night before. The sadness behind his calm voice. The way he looked at ordinary things like they belonged to another world entirely. She was still staring absent-mindedly at the snowfall outside when Rick walked in carrying a broom. "Road crews finally opened one lane eastbound," he announced. "Civilization survives another day." Maddie smiled faintly. That dramatic speech deserves coffee. Already had 3 cups. He glanced toward the hallway leading to room 12. "Your mystery guest awake yet?" Maddie looked toward the door instinctively. Not sure. But something already felt strange. Quiet. Too quiet. A few minutes later, she grabbed fresh towels and headed down the hallway. Room 12 stood slightly open. Maddie knocked gently anyway. "Adrian." No answer. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. The bed had been neatly made. The extra blankets folded carefully at the foot of the mattress. The heater still rattled weakly in the corner. But Adrian was gone. Maddie stopped in the doorway, confused by the sudden disappointment that hit her chest. She looked around the room once more before noticing something on the nightstand. Her navy scarf, folded perfectly beside a handwritten note. Maddie picked it up carefully. The handwriting was sharp and precise. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. I will never forget what you did for me." Adrian, she stared at the note for several seconds. That was it. No explanation. No last name. No phone number. Just gone. Maddie folded the paper slowly and slipped it into her pocket without knowing why. Maybe because some small part of her already knew she would read it again later. "Well," Rick called from the hallway. Maddie glanced back toward the empty room. He left. Rick peeked inside and shrugged. Probably for the best. But it did not feel like the best. It felt unfinished somehow. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Truckers checked out. Snowplows crawled along the highway outside. By noon, the motel had returned to its normal rhythm of quiet emptiness. Maddie tried focusing on work, but every now and then her eyes drifted toward the folded note in her apron pocket. Around 3 in the afternoon, the television above the lobby suddenly switched from weather coverage to breaking news. The anchor's voice sharpened with urgency. After nearly 72 hours missing during severe winter conditions, billionaire investor Adrian Whitmore has officially been located safe this afternoon. Maddie froze behind the counter. On the television screen appeared the face she had seen across the kitchen table only hours earlier. Except now he wore a dark tailored coat, surrounded by flashing cameras and security guards. Reporters crowded around him outside a private airport terminal while headlines exploded beneath the screen. Adrian Whitmore found safe. CEO disappearance ends. Whitmore Capital Board under investigation after sudden exit. Maddie stared at the television in complete disbelief. Rick slowly lowered his coffee cup. No way. The screen shifted to aerial footage of black SUVs outside a Manhattan skyscraper, while reporters spoke rapidly about stock markets, billion-dollar companies, and rumors surrounding Whitmore Capital. Maddie barely heard any of it. Her mind stayed trapped on one impossible thought. Adrian, the quiet man eating grilled cheese in the motel kitchen. The exhausted stranger wrapped in Danny's scarf. Billionaire? Rick let out a stunned laugh. Maddie, do you realize you let some billionaire sleep in room 12 next to the broken ice machine? She could not answer. The television replayed footage of Adrian stepping out of an SUV earlier that afternoon. Clean-shaven now. Composed. Untouchable. He looked completely different surrounded by cameras and wealth. Yet Maddie still recognized the exhaustion hidden behind his eyes instantly. One reporter shouted questions as Adrian paused briefly before entering the building. Mr. Whitmore, where were you for the last 3 days? Adrian stopped for half a second. Snow fell lightly around the cameras in New York. His expression remained calm, but something softer appeared in his eyes. Somewhere kind. He answered quietly before disappearing inside. Maddie felt her heartbeat stumble. Rick turned slowly toward her. Okay, he said carefully. Now I officially think you are living inside a Hallmark movie. But Maddie barely heard him, because suddenly every strange detail made sense. The expensive watch, the quiet confidence, the sadness in his voice when he talked about people. Adrian had not just been running from a bad night. He had been running from an entire world. She looked down at the folded note still resting in her hand. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. Outside the motel windows, snow continued falling softly across the empty Wyoming highway. But somewhere nearly 2,000 miles away, Adrian Whitmore had already returned to a world of skyscrapers, private jets, and cameras flashing in his face. A world so far removed from the Blue Cedar Motel that it should have erased the entire night completely. Yet for reasons Maddie could not explain, she had the strange feeling this was not the last time their paths would cross. 3 weeks passed, but the motel still felt different after Adrian left. Maddie noticed it most during quiet moments. When she poured coffee at 2 in the morning. When snow drifted across the empty parking lot outside room 12. When she caught herself glancing toward the highway every time headlights appeared in the distance. It annoyed her honestly. She barely knew the man. One strange night during a storm should not have stayed in her mind this long. Yet somehow it did. Maybe because life at the Blue Cedar Motel had returned to normal too quickly afterward. The same peeling wallpaper. The same exhausted truckers. The same overdue bills stacked inside her locker beneath the front desk. Some mornings, she wondered if meeting Adrian had even happened at all until she touched the folded note still tucked safely inside her wallet. Rick noticed the change too. One slow Tuesday night, he slid a plate of fries onto the counter beside her. You know, he said casually, most women frame autographs from billionaires. Maddie looked up from her paperwork. It was not an autograph. Close enough. She rolled her eyes. You are never letting this go, are you? Absolutely not. He leaned against the counter with a grin. You fed grilled cheese to one of the richest men in America. That is a story people tell at retirement homes. Maddie laughed softly despite herself. He probably forgot I exist the second he got back on his private jet. But even as she said it, something about the words felt wrong. Because she still remembered the way Adrian looked at her in the kitchen that night. Like kindness itself had surprised him. Around 8 that evening, the sound of engines echoed outside the motel. Not one vehicle. Several. Rick frowned immediately and looked out the window. What in the world? Maddie turned toward the parking lot, just as 3 black SUVs pulled in through the snow. Expensive. Glossy. Completely out of place beside the flickering motel sign. Her stomach tightened instantly. The SUV doors opened almost simultaneously. Men in dark coats stepped out first, scanning the area calmly. Then another door opened in the center vehicle. Adrian stepped out slowly into the cold Wyoming air. Maddie stopped breathing for a second. He looked nothing like the exhausted stranger from room 12 now. His dark wool coat fit perfectly. His posture was composed again. Powerful even. But when he lifted his eyes toward the motel office and saw her standing behind the front desk, something warm immediately softened his expression. Rick whispered under his breath, Okay, this officially became a movie. The motel door opened and cold air rushed inside as Adrian walked in alone. The security team remained outside near the SUVs. Every customer in the lobby turned to stare. Maddie suddenly became painfully aware of her faded blue uniform and the coffee stain on her sleeve. Adrian stopped in front of the counter, and for one strange moment neither of them spoke. Then finally he smiled softly. "Hi, Maddie." Her heart betrayed her with one hard, nervous beat. "Hi." Up close, he still looked tired beneath the polished appearance. Not physically this time. Emotionally. Like returning to his world had cost him something. Adrian glanced briefly around the old motel lobby before looking back at her. "I was hoping you were working tonight." Rick suddenly stood up. "I am going to check on absolutely nothing in the back room," he announced before disappearing immediately. Maddie fought a smile. Adrian noticed too. "He does not like me much." Actually, Rick only dislikes people who microwave fish in the lobby. Adrian laughed quietly, and once again the sound surprised her. Billionaire or not, there was something strangely genuine about him when he forgot to be guarded. "I owe you an apology," he said after a moment. Maddie blinked. "For what?" "Leaving without saying goodbye properly." She crossed her arms lightly. "You left a note." That did not feel like enough. The lobby grew quieter around them. Snow tapped softly against the windows while truck headlights passed along the distant highway. Adrian reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded carefully in his hand. The navy scarf. Maddie looked surprised. "You kept it." "I meant to return it sooner." His voice lowered slightly. "Truthfully, I think it was the first kind thing anybody had given me in years." The words settled gently between them. Maddie looked down at the scarf in his hands. The old wool looked completely out of place against his expensive coat and polished appearance. Yet somehow Adrian carried it carefully, like it mattered more than anything money could buy. "You came all the way back to Wyoming for a scarf?" she asked softly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No." Her breath caught slightly at the honesty in his eyes. Before she could respond, one of the security men stepped cautiously into the lobby. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly. "The board call starts in 20 minutes. Adrian barely glanced back. "Reschedule it." The man looked stunned. "Sir, it is the quarterly, tomorrow." The security guard nodded immediately and stepped outside again. Maddie stared at Adrian in disbelief. "You just postponed some billionaire meeting because of a motel conversation?" Adrian's gaze never left hers. "Some things are more important than meetings." The warmth in his voice made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Outside, snow drifted softly around the black SUVs and flashing headlights. But inside the tiny blue cedar motel lobby, Maddie suddenly realized something dangerous was happening. Adrian Whitmore had not come back because he felt obligated. He came back because somehow, against all logic, the lonely billionaire who could have been anywhere in the world had chosen to return to her. The Blue Cedar Motel had never looked smaller to Maddie than it did standing beside Adrian Whitmore. Customers pretended not to stare while sneaking glances over coffee cups. The neon lights buzzed softly overhead, reflecting against the polished black SUVs outside. Everything about Adrian belonged to another universe entirely, yet somehow he stood at the old motel counter like he fit there naturally. Maddie still could not fully process it. 1 month ago, she had been eating microwave noodles alone during night shifts. Now one of the most powerful men in America was standing in front of her postponing billion-dollar meetings just to talk to her. "This is surreal," she admitted quietly. Adrian smiled faintly. "You should see my world. It gets worse." She laughed before she could stop herself. Adrian leaned one arm against the counter, his expression softening again when he looked at her. "Can you take a break?" Maddie glanced toward the hallway. "Rick will complain dramatically for at least 20 minutes. I can survive that. You clearly have never worked hospitality." But despite the teasing, she grabbed her coat from the hook beside the register. 10 minutes later, they sat inside a small 24-hour diner 2 miles from the motel while snow drifted quietly past the windows. The place smelled like maple syrup and fresh coffee. A tired waitress refilled their mugs every 5 minutes without recognizing Adrian at all, which seemed to relax him more with every passing minute. Maddie noticed he looked different away from the cameras and security team. Less tense, more like the man from the motel kitchen. "So," she said carefully, stirring cream into her coffee, "what exactly happened before you ended up outside my motel?" Adrian looked out the window for a moment before answering. "I walked out of my own engagement party." Maddie blinked. "That sounds unhealthy." "It was strategic. Leaving your fiancé during a snowstorm is strategic." A tired smile crossed his face. She was not really my fiancée. Maddie leaned back slightly. Now that sounds extremely rich person complicated. Adrian let out another quiet laugh before his expression faded again. Everything in my life became a transaction eventually. Business relationships pretending to be friendships. Public appearances pretending to be happiness. His fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. After a while, I stopped recognizing myself. Maddie watched him carefully. So you ran. I disappeared. That is just rich people vocabulary for running. Adrian accepted that with a small nod. Maybe. The waitress arrived with pancakes and bacon before the conversation grew heavier. Adrian thanked her politely, and Maddie noticed something interesting immediately. Despite his wealth, he treated people working service jobs with genuine attention. Eye contact, respect, gratitude. Most customers barely looked at waitresses at all. You are staring, Adrian said softly once they were alone again. Maddie looked down quickly. Sorry, what were you thinking? She hesitated before answering honestly. That you do not act like rich people usually act. Adrian looked almost amused. And how do rich people usually act? Like tipping $20 cancels out being rude. That earned a real laugh from him this time. Warm, genuine, the kind that reached his eyes completely. Maddie felt her chest tighten unexpectedly again. Dangerous, very dangerous. She quickly took a sip of coffee to hide it. Adrian studied her quietly for a second afterward. You know, he said softly, you are the first person in a long time who talks to me like I am normal. Maddie raised an eyebrow. You slept in a roadside motel during a blizzard. That automatically makes you at least a little normal. His smile faded gently into something more serious. No, I mean really normal. The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than it should have. Because Maddie understood loneliness. She understood what it felt like to become invisible in your own life. Somehow Adrian did too, even surrounded by money and power. For a while they simply ate and talked while snow continued falling outside the diner windows. Maddie told him stories about growing up in Wyoming. About Danny teaching her how to drive in empty parking lots. About her mother singing old country songs while cooking dinner. Adrian listened to every word carefully, like these ordinary memories fascinated him. Finally, he set his coffee cup down and looked at her with quiet determination. I came back because I want to ask you something. Maddie immediately became suspicious. That sentence never ends well. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and slid a folder gently across the table toward her. She frowned and opened it slowly. Inside were architectural drawings and business plans. At the top of the first page was a name. The Room 12 Project. Maddie looked up in confusion. Adrian spoke carefully now, his voice steady but deeply sincere. Every winter thousands of people end up stranded during storms across the Midwest. Families, truck drivers, people with nowhere safe to go. He tapped lightly against the blueprint pages. I want to turn old motels into emergency shelter hotels during severe weather conditions. Warm beds, food, temporary housing. Maddie stared down at the plans again. This is real. Completely. Why are you showing me this? Adrian held her gaze steadily. Because I want you to help me build it. Her breath caught softly. Adrian, you understand people in ways my world forgot how to. His voice lowered slightly. You saw a stranger freezing in the snow and chose kindness before you knew who I was. That matters more than any business degree I have ever seen. Maddie looked down quickly, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his expression. Nobody had spoken to her like this before. Not with admiration. Not with belief. For years she had felt stuck behind motel counters and unpaid bills, surviving instead of living. But sitting across from Adrian now, listening to him speak about purpose instead of money, something long asleep inside her began to stir quietly awake again. 2 months later, Maddie barely recognized her own life. The Blue Cedar Motel still stood beside the frozen Wyoming highway, but now half the empty rooms had been renovated into temporary emergency shelters through the Room 12 project. Fresh blankets replaced stained bedding. The broken vending machines disappeared. Volunteers from nearby towns delivered hot meals during storms. What started as Adrian's idea had slowly become something real, and somehow, Maddie had become part of it. Most mornings, she still woke up expecting everything to vanish like a dream. But then she would walk through the motel lobby and see families drinking coffee safely inside during snowstorms instead of sleeping in stranded cars. She would hear truck drivers thanking volunteers for warm food. And every single time, she remembered Adrian sitting across from her in that diner saying, "You understand people in ways my world forgot how to." Nobody had ever believed in her like that before. Adrian visited Wyoming constantly now, sometimes for meetings, sometimes supposedly for inspections. But Maddie had started noticing that many of his visits conveniently happened even when there was nothing urgent to inspect at all. Rick noticed too. That man flew 1,800 miles to eat diner pancakes with you. He whispered one afternoon while stocking coffee filters. At this point, just kiss dramatically in the snow and save everyone time. Maddie nearly dropped an entire tray of mugs. Rick, he shrugged. I am old. I see things. The truth was, Maddie tried very hard not to think too deeply about whatever was happening between her and Adrian. Because the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the way he looked at her, or the way her chest tightened every time his black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Some nights they stayed up for hours sitting in the motel office talking about everything except the obvious thing growing quietly between them. Adrian told her stories about building